Good morning. I'm Neysa Jensen. I'm a member of Cathedral of the Rockies. We've been here for 30 years. I participate a lot in the music program, playing flute and handbells mostly, and I usually attend the 11 o'clock service, although these days don't we all attend from our couch at home. So I am a member of the board of directors of NAMI Treasure Valley. NAMI stands for National Alliance on Mental Illness. And I got involved with NAMI a few years ago because I felt it was time for me to add my voice to help those living with mental illness and their families. I have lived with a mental illness since I was a teenager. I lived for over 20 years with it not being treated, and then I've lived for over 20 years with it treated. And I always tell people treatment is so much better, such a much better way to live. So today I want to talk to you about the stigma surrounding mental illness and how we can work to eliminate that stigma. But first I want to share with you a couple of statistics. Sometimes people don't really like statistics, but I kind of do because they give a little perspective. First of all, 1 in 5 people in the US live with mental illness. So that means it really impacts all of us because it could be you, it could be a spouse, it could be children, grandparents, parents, neighbors, coworkers, friends. So it's likely that somebody in your life lives with a mental illness. So it does impact you directly because you have to interact with that person and you have to maybe work with that person. And there are ways to make that better for everyone. One of the problems surrounding mental illness is the lag in time from onset of symptoms to when a person receives or seeks treatment. There are a lot of reasons for that lag in time. Sometimes people don't realize they have a mental illness. When I first started showing symptoms as a teenager, I didn't think about it as a mental illness. I thought there was something wrong with me, but I didn't connect it with mental illness. So sometimes that's the issue. But a lot of times the issue is stigma. And even my mother acknowledged that when she saw changes occurring in my demeanor, my personality, my moods, she thought maybe she should have me see a counselor. But because of stigma, she did not. I don't blame her for that. That's just part of life. I have since gotten the treatment I need and I'm okay with that. But I think that happens to a lot of people. I think stigma is a big problem. But I want to make sure we all are on the same page when we're talking about stigma. So stigma is basically the sort of overall atmosphere of negativity surrounding mental illness. It can come in the form of shame, judgment, bullying. It can also be sort of an internalized stigma where a person might think to themselves that, they might feel like they have a mental illness or need some help, but they feel ashamed inwardly of themselves for such an issue, like it's their fault for some reason. Sometimes there's a lot of blame surrounding mental illness, especially in a parent-child situation. The parent might feel like it's their fault, or a child might blame their parent for whatever they think the parent might have done to bring on a mental illness. There's often a lot of secrecy. The atmosphere that I grew up in did involve things that you don't talk about, and one of them was mental illness. And I think it's important that we talk about mental illness. I think that's part of how we are going to fight the stigma. And that is one of the reasons that I feel compelled to talk about my own mental illness frequently and quite openly, so that other people can see I'm a relatively normal person, and I live with a mental illness. So I want to normalize it. I want people to see that a lot of people around them have mental illness, and it's okay. It's not scary. Those people are not dangerous. There's not something, inherently wrong with that person, but that they have an illness that needs to be treated. Some other statistics we know about mental illness and the stigma around it. We know that people with mental illness, especially if they are in a state of not being treated and having obvious symptoms, are less likely to be hired. They're less likely to get safe housing. They're more likely to be criminalized than offered healthcare services, and that's really a whole nother video that we could talk about. They sometimes don't pursue opportunities because they're afraid of rejection. They're often seen as dangerous, and sometimes even seen as irresponsible and not able to make their own decisions. But most of all, they're seen as aliens or others, the other, them, not us. And that makes their decision to seek treatment harder, and it makes it harder for them to live in society. So, there are many ways that this stigma gets carried through society. And so I think we need to approach it from a way of how can we live our lives not adding to that stigma and actually being advocates to help eliminate that stigma. And a couple more statistics before I get to those. The average person with mental illness, the time lag between when they have onset of symptoms and they seek treatment is about 8 to 10 years. And that 8 to 10 years is, first of all, a lot of time, right? But it's also a debilitating. It can become a spiral where the mental illness gets worse and worse, and other aspects can enter in. The person with mental illness might try to self-medicate during that time. Oftentimes that happens with drugs and alcohol, and then they develop issues with that, which just exacerbates all of their other problems. Also, it can lead to lower wage earnings. It can lead to problems with relationships. So the sooner a person can get treatment, the better. The better it will be for them and those around them, quite frankly. Less than half of the adults in the U.S. get treated for the mental illness when they have it. And again, all those same criteria apply. They're less likely to be successful in jobs, in relationships, etc. And of course, one thing that we are constantly aware of, especially in Idaho, we have the worst rate of suicide in Idaho, almost of the entire country. And suicide rates are higher in those who are not getting treated, and sometimes even in those who are getting treated. So it's important to eliminate the stigma around mental illness so that people can feel safe and included and part of regular society and not feel so alienated. So I guess the question then is, what do we do as individuals? First and foremost, I think the thing that we can all do is not to be afraid of talking about mental illness, which is why I'm here talking to you. The more we talk about it, the more normal it becomes. It can be scary. Sometimes we don't understand what a person might be going through. Sometimes we have let the media control the narrative in a way. We see movies, we see TV shows, we see commentators even on the news talking about mental illness. For example, oftentimes mass shooters in America are labeled as mentally ill. Now, that could be true. Sometimes they might be mentally ill, but I don't know. I'm trying to think of certain cases. I don't think that applies to every single case. I won't even get into the causes of mass shootings because that's a whole 8 more videos we could do to talk about that. What I do want to talk about, though, is the fact that if we don't talk about mental illness, then it becomes a taboo and a scary subject that for some reason we don't talk about. And believe it or not, kids and teens pick up on what it's okay to talk about and what it's not okay to talk about. And if we're not talking about it, they assume it's because it's not okay to talk about it. So I think first and foremost, let's talk. You know, if you're hanging around with a bunch of friends, you can bring the subject up. Or if you've watched a movie where someone is living with a mental illness, talk about it with the people that you're with. Talk about it around your dinner table. We talk about mental health quite frequently and how to take care of our mental health, and that's really important. Everyone needs to do that. What we forget in that conversation sometimes is mental illness and what that might be. I did another video for Mental Health Mondays where I talked about the symptoms of mental illness. And so you can use that as a jumping off point. You can say, here are the symptoms of mental illness. Do you know anyone who's exhibiting those symptoms? Do you feel any of those symptoms coming on in yourself? And then you can use that to expand and further talk about mental illness. There are a lot of great resources, and I'll plug NAMI again. NAMI.org, NAMI.org is a great treasure trove of resources about mental illness, all the different diagnoses and stories from people living with that disease. So the conversation is the most important part. And part of that conversation, obviously, is the language we use. And I think this is something that we're learning as society to be more careful with our language usage. And I'll give you a few examples. I mean, we've all experienced moments where, you know, somebody will say, well, she's just crazy. You know, she's not right in the head. Something's wrong with her. She doesn't play with a full deck of cards. All those kinds of phrases are sort of demeaning and insulting. And they make it sound like a person who isn't playing with that full deck of cards, something's wrong with them. And in a way, something is wrong with them, but it's just a thing, you know, it's just an illness like any other illness. We wouldn't make fun of a person with cancer and say, oh man, you know, she's not playing with a full deck, because it's a disease, and so is mental illness. So some of the things we can do in our language are to not use phrases like that, like she's crazy, or she's so OCD about somebody who's super organized, for example. OCD is a debilitating disease, and it's very hard to live with, and it's paralyzing, and we don't want to make light of that. We should be careful about how we talk about people who are just maybe super organized as opposed to real people who are living with OCD.